Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to the last session of Teacher Eddie's 10p live sharing. All right. Okay, so we've reached lesson 6 already. All right, session 6. And today we'll be wrapping up our story. All right, our story about James punching Steve. Okay, hello, 今天. Hello, Evangeline. Welcome. All right. So as we wait for more of our friends to join, all right, hello, Primaya. Welcome. Okay, hello, Muting. All right, so as your friends keep on joining us, all right, field tips once again. 2 forms of communication in the session, all right? You can type in the chat box anytime. Please not spam me, all right? Don't send your message multiple times, and I will be able to see everyone's message. And of course, the second way of participation is through the microphone, all right? If you're participating through the microphone, if you're unmuted, everyone will be able to hear your voice, just like everyone's hearing Teacher Hetty's voice right now. All right? Okay. Hello. All right. So that being said, welcome to 10p live sharing once again. Last session from Teacher Hetty. All right. Don't worry, there will be new sessions coming right up. All right. About the same time next week, we'll be talking about paper 2 contents with the other teachers from 10p. All right. Okay, so please stay tuned for those. All right. If you have not reserved your seats yet, please do. All right. So we are at lesson 6. All right. Final session. So today we'll be starting from the end. All right, starting from the end. Starting from the end, that's a very common saying, all right? It means to start with the result, all right? Think about the result first before you start doing something. All right. Okay, that's not exactly what we are going to do, but it's also a technique in writing where you can tell your readers the ending first. Tell them the conclusion, the ending first, before you tell them the story. That sounds very, very risky, don't it? All right. Imagine if you're writing your final actions first in your composition. Sounds very risky. Right. It is at times it's tricky, but it's doable. And we'll talk about some tips of doing that, all right, some things to take note of if you do want to start your story from the end. Ultimately, the fun arrangements of your story. All right. So last week we were talking about characters. Characters being the core of the story, being the narrator of your story. All right. Characters and their characteristics can be shown through their speech and their action. All right. So show and not tell. All right. Don't just tell your readers, I have a hot tempered character here. Show them. Show them that James is so hot tempered that he punched Steve thinking, all right, having a misunderstanding, thinking that Steve had done something wrong. Steve wanted to push him off the field. Right, that shows that James is a hot-tempered character. Okay. All right, so little recap, that was your homework from last week, all right? Okay, not a lot of you guys have completed this homework. I understand because this is harder than our usual homework, all right? And it requires more context, right? So for some of you who have done, most of you guys picked reason number 2 for why James punched Steve. All right, so Steve was rude and pushed James first. That's a very good reason. All right, but if you're writing this reason, all right, your answer will look different from Teacher Hetty's simple answer here. You would have to say, all right, James would have to stand up and point at Steve and said, "You pushed me first." All right. Okay, that's why I'm punching you in the face. That's James' argument. You would have to show that. All right, so James is not in fault here. He's fighting back. In this case, the blame is on Steve. In all the other 2 reasons, all right, reason 1 and 3, James was hot-tempered and attacked Steve first, or there was a misunderstanding and James overreacted. In these cases, James is at fault. It's James' fault, right, that the fight happened. All right, so that's the main difference between the 3 reasons, all right? If you have not attempted the homework, feel free to still do it in our Telegram group. All right, yes, Evangeline, I saw your answer. All right, I shall give you a little feedback later after the session. All right. Okay, so today Now you have a reason, all right? We talked about action, all right? Punching, exact actions. We talked about rising action. We talked about motives. We talked about the characters' final actions, all right? So the speech where they explain themselves, this homework is the final action, all right? It's the final action. It's when the fight is over and they have to start solving the problem, all right? Your story should not end with the two characters fighting. Your readers will want to know how the fight ended, who was at fault, and did they make up? All right. So that being said, we now have the important elements of a story. All right, we have most of the elements of the story, and now it's time we tell the story properly. Right, now it's time we tell the story properly. And it doesn't have to be the same every time. All right, how many of you guys have started your story with it's a sunny Saturday and James and Steve decided to play basketball at the neighborhood court? Or any story like this started with the weather, started with what day it is, started with where they are. Right? You don't always have to do that. It's the safest way and it's the easiest way, it's the clearest way, but you don't have to do that if you don't have to always do that if you feel like it's bored. If you want to be more creative, before you be creative, you have to know two concepts: the development of an event and the narration of a story. These two are different. Right? These two are different. The development of an event is always introduction, all right? Rising action, climax, falling action, and ending. That's how everything happens, all right? That's how everything happens. Even when you're at class, teacher already has to do an introduction first. I have to gradually build up to our topic today, and I'll talk about the topic. And after that, we have a little recap and something to look forward to, right? That's the development of an event. That's the development of any event. However, the narration of the story is different. That's where we can play. All right, but before we move on to narration, the development of an event. What needs to be included in an event that you are describing? What are the steps where an event took place? All right. Okay. So, the main elements, the elements of the story. No matter how you plan to tell your story, all right? These elements, they have to be clear for the event in your composition to be complete. Any guesses what they are? All right, the elements. Things that you think of first before you start writing a composition. All right. What do you ask yourself when you start planning a story? What are the things you have to write down or have to think about before you start writing? There's there's a lot of phrases, all right? This is remembered as a okay, all right, there's a short form, there's an abbreviation for it. Okay, what do you think it is? Aprima, do you have a question? Is my voice still clear? Or is it lagging very badly? Right. Okay, Aprima thinks, okay, how exciting will my climax be if I choose this storyline? Very good question, very good question. But before that, you have to have a story before you can decide what to write, right? So thank you, Aprima. So what is the story? What makes up the story? All right, you've probably heard this phrase multiple times. And it's called the five what? The five W's and one H. All right, the five W's and one H. These are the elements that make up any story, any event. All right, Virginia says the five senses. The five senses are ways to describe. All right, the five W's and one H. All right, the H stands for how. Right, that's the procedure, that's the process of your story. We'll talk about that later. What are the five W's in the chat? What are the five W's? First of all, who, right? Who is the character? Who? Teacher Hetty? Aprimaya? Or is this story about Muqing? You have to tell your readers. Or is it about Steve and James? Who is the character, right? All right, yes, very good. When and where did the story take place? All right, when and where. And of course, what happened? Why is there a story? What's the thing that we need to know? And of course, why did that thing happen? All right, why did that thing happen? Okay, so I have come up with a chart, all right, for our story on Steve and James, all right, on James punching Steve. Let's use teacher Hetty's reason, all right? The misunderstanding. Okay. All right, so who? The characters in the story, the main characters, Steve and James, all right? These are your characters. They have to be there. You have to introduce them. All right, when? That tells you a little information about the day, all right, or the time where your story takes place, all right? For example, on a sunny Saturday, right? Where? The location of the main event, right? The location of the main event has to be described. Okay, it doesn't matter if James woke up from his bed on the eighth story, all right? That's a minor detail. The main event is when they're playing basketball and when they had a fight, right? Okay, so that location, the basketball field, that's the main location that you have to describe. James' bedroom, that's a minor detail that you can include, but you don't have to describe about, right? Because it's a little irrelevant to your story. All right. And of course, what? What is asking for the main event. If I were to summarize the story in one sentence, what would I say? All right. James and Steve had a fight on the basketball field, right? Okay. So, the main event in this story, the exciting part, is it the fact that they are playing basketball or is it the fact that they had a fight? Right? The fact that they had a fight, right? That's the exciting part. If your story is about a fight, an argument, all right, make sure you emphasize that. That is your main event. How they play basketball, who scored how many goals, those are minor details that can be used to set up your story, but that shouldn't be the main focus. All right. So the main event is that these two characters, your main characters, had a fight. Right? And why? Asking for the motive. We've talked about that, right? We've talked about motives. Okay, the reason why someone did something, all right, the reason why they had a fight. There was a misunderstanding, all right, and James overreacted. That's why. That's why the fight happened. Okay, so that's the elements. And with the elements, we can now form, all right, we should now plan our plot mountain. All right. Aprima, can we start our composition with an action, all right, with a verb? Of course. Right, running across the field. James was bouncing the ball. All right, running across the field, running straight towards Steve. James punched him in the face. Feel free to start your story with a verb. All right, make sure it's a grammatically correct sentence. That's it. All right, the plot mountain. The plot mountain isn't exactly how you're going to write your story, but it is how your story, all right, how everything in your story developed. Okay, so you have to have an introduction, all right, introduce the setting of your story. Starting from the introduction, the rising action, the problem is forming, there's a problem developing. The climax, the most exciting part, the action packed part of your story. The point of no turning back, something has to happen here. All right, and from there, all right, the tipping point, down we go with the falling action. The problem should be solved, right? The problem that is developing, the problem that is shown in the climax, it should be solved in your falling action. And finally, after the problem is solved, a conclusion. What did you learn? What would you do in the future? All right, those are all important things. This is a complete event, a beginning, a middle, and an end. This is a complete event. No matter how you choose to narrate your story, these elements have to be there, and this is how they happened. All right, there's a beginning and an ending at every event, no matter how you write it. Please remember that. If you start with the climax, all right, if you start with the climax, remember you still have to write the introduction and the rising action, all right? You cannot start with the climax and only write falling action and ending. That would not be a complete story. Okay. All right, so this is the plot mountain for our story where James punched Steve. All right, Steve and James were playing basketball together. James looked annoying for some reason and confronted Steve. James then punched Steve in the face, all right, and they had a fight. That's the action-packed part. That's the climax. Falling action. Steve wants to solve the problem. Steve asks for an explanation. and James realized that there was a misunderstanding. Okay. Maybe Steve was trying to protect him from something, that's why he pushed him a little. Whereas James thought, you're jealous I'm winning. You just want to push me so I cannot score another goal. Well, that would be a misunderstanding. And once Steve explained to James, there was a falling branch, it almost hit you. That's why I pushed you. James would have realized, right? And after that, James, knowing that he is in fault, knowing that he misunderstood Steve, would have to apologize to him. And that's how your story would end, right? The ending. And from there, James will learn not to be so hot tempered and not to judge people too fast in the future. That will be his lesson learned and future action. So these are the elements that make a complete story. These are the elements that make a complete story. And they have to be present in your story, in your composition, if you're writing about the story, no matter how you describe it. Okay. Are these clear? So this is probably what your teachers, what you've learned in school, what you've practiced over and over again, the plot mountain. Introduction, rising action, climax, falling action, ending. That's a story and that's it. It's like you have a structure, then you're just filling in the blanks. Yeah, don't judge a book by its cover. Very good, Aprimaya. Very good. All right. Okay. This is a structure. This is a structure that a lot of you guys follow when you're writing. And I mean, ask yourselves. At times it gets boring, right? You're tired of starting with a sunny Saturday. Okay. So here's the trick. The arrangement of your story. Now that we have the plot mountain, we have a clear and complete story. Here's the fun part. You don't always have to write your story starting from the introduction and continue on to rising action, climax, falling action, and conclusion. There are some other ways to start it. All right, so where do you want to start? Introduction, the usual way. This is the classic way to tell the story. It follows the development of the event and is clear and easy for your readers to understand. All right, so this is the easiest way, and you will start with the introduction, rising action, climax, falling action, conclusion. All right, so that's how your story will progress. This is the most basic way. All right, this is the most basic way. Typical narration, typical narrative. Now, start with the climax. Start with James punch Steve in the face. Since you've started the story with the most exciting part, so this is the pro of starting with the climax, this narrative will get your reader's attention immediately. All right, James punched Steve in the face. Why? What? Huh? What happened? What? If they have any of these questions, all right, their attention is caught, right? And they would want to read on to find out what exactly happened. Right, so by starting with the climax, starting with the most exciting part, you've caught your reader's attention. All right, and that's very important. Right, once you caught your reader's attention, you probably have them for your entire story. Okay, so if you start with the climax, the usual development of your story would be climax, introduction, rising action, falling action, and conclusion. All right, so you notice that climax went to the front, and somehow introduction and rising action, these two parts are bolded and italic. Right, that means that this is a flashback. All right, this is a flashback. This is when you bring your readers back before when your narration starts to tell them what happened before. All right, so what happened before James punched Steve? You have to tell the readers that first. Build up to the climax as usual. All right, rising action, and then you have a point there where you reach your climax again. That's when you tell your readers, and the fight happened. All right, they had a big fight. And from there, you don't have to describe it a lot again because you've already described the climax at the beginning, right? That's when the flashback ends, all right? So you need to tell your readers, all right, we're here back in the point where they are having the fight. Let's see how the story will then end. All right. So the introduction and the rising action, these two are the flashbacks. All right. And Prima is asking, can we start with falling action? You could. You could start. You could also start with the rising action. You could build up to the problem and then tell us why. Where are they? Or you could start with the following action, all right, and tell us the ending, then turn back and tell us when, where, and how did this problem came to be. You can start with anywhere you want, all right? The most classic ways are starting with the introduction, starting with the climax, and of course, starting with the conclusion. All right. Okay. All right, so if you start with the conclusion, this narrative will probably confuse your readers a little at first. Right? But that is a good confusion. Right? Your readers are going to be confused and they would be thinking, how did they learn this? And that will drive your readers to find out how did the characters reach this ending. And that's what you want because they want to find out that, well, they would read your story. All right, because they have to read your story to find out why. Right? You're the only one who knows. Okay, so if you're starting from the conclusion, start from the conclusion. The introduction, rising action, climax, and falling action are all flashbacks, right? Are all flashbacks. But remember one thing: you have to bring your readers back into the present, right? Back to the point where the story started. So, in case, all right. So in case you're starting with a conclusion, right? You need to repeat the conclusion, all right? Once again, further conclude the story at the end to bring your readers back to the point of your narration. All right, Aprima is asking for an example of starting the composition with a conclusion. All right, so for example, instead of starting your story with James punched Steve in the face, you can start with James hung his head and said, "I'm sorry, Steve. I should not have acted so hot-temperedly." Right? You're starting from the ending where James apologized to Steve. Okay, maybe Steve says, "It's okay, I forgive you." All right. And then you could say, all right, as James hung his head low, he started thinking about the events and how they came to be. All right, that will bring your readers back in time and you can start from the beginning. It was a sunny Saturday, all right? Okay, no problem. All right, so anyways, you can start from any part of the story, but make sure all the things that happened before that point, all right? Remember the plot mountain? Everything that happened before the point you started with is a flashback. That should be narrated as a flashback. And here are some things to take note of when you're writing flashbacks. Right? The transitions. The transitions in flashback. Notify your readers, right? Tell them when the flashback is beginning or when it's over. You have to give them some clue so that they know what they're reading. Right? For example, I remembered when, right? Signaling the start of the flashback when sometime in the past. All right? My mind drifted back to the past. All right? Something to bring them back, coming back from my memory. All right? Something drew me back to the present. All right? Usually a voice or an action drew me back to the present. All right? The flashback is over. It's the present now. All right? But once again, remember, the present in your story should still be written in past tense because that story has to happen. The whole event has to happen already for you to be able to write it, right? Okay, so your story has to be in past tense, right? The present of your story is the simple past. Okay, so when you're writing flashbacks, you have to be careful of your tenses. Okay, events and actions that took place in flashbacks has been done even before the time where your narration in the story starts, right? They have been done in the past, something that's already done. So you can use simple past, right? When you're writing your story, when you're writing the present, right? When you're writing the present of your story. But for the flashbacks, right? You cannot use the simple past because it's further back in time, right? Past perfect, all right? Past perfect continuous or present perfect continuous, right? Something that happened in the past and carried on into the present. That's usually for ending lessons, all right? So an example of ways to write it would be James had been playing basketball instead of James played basketball. James played basketball is simple past. James had been playing. That's the past perfect, all right? He had been playing basketball with Steve. When suddenly, right, something fall, it started raining, whatever happened, right? That's something in the past before your story starts. All right. Okay, can you hear me, Ihan? All right. So be very careful of transitioning if you're writing a flashback, right? Or else your story would look very messy, all right? And transitions is usually why, all right? Usually why teachers tell you to be careful to write the flashback. Teachers tell you just start with a sunny Saturday. Just start with the introduction, right? Yes, that's the safest way. But if you have planned your stories carefully, you shall have the freedom to tell it in a fun way, to tell it in a more creative way. All right, so if you have planned your story well, and make sure you do, you will have the freedom to tell it in a fun way. So, last, final takeaway for this class: plan your story carefully. Remember each and every part of how it developed. Make sure you explain and describe every aspect of your story. And if you have that, well, you have the freedom. You know you can do it. You know you can tell it in an interesting way. That's the basis. A good planning, right? Good planning skill is the basis of creating an interesting, exciting, unique, fun story. All right. Okay, so that's the final takeaway. If anything, all right, if you remember one thing from this class, please remember, plan your story and explain. All right? Okay. Any questions? Aprimaya, you have a question, right? I will unmute you. Hello, Aprimaya.
Hello.
Hello.
The question I have is, can we use the same paragraph for the starting of the story and ending it? Like, for example, you say that you start with a character description, like Jane is a petite girl with long hair. Then, like, we end it with the same way, like the whole paragraph is the same.
You mean copy the same paragraph from your beginning to your ending?
Yeah.
Um, usually don't do that because it will be very repetitive. If you do want to emphasize that your story is a circle, right? It started from the end and you came back to it, maybe pick a sentence to repeat, not the same paragraph. Pick a short sentence to repeat. Maybe that could be a way to emphasize, but do not repeat this whole paragraph, especially if it's not something that's very, a punchline or something. Right? So try not to repeat the whole paragraph. You can repeat that let me think of an example. I cannot really think of a composition example, but like in literature, sometimes you can start with maybe say, um, this is the best time. This is the worst time. Like the tale of two cities, right? And you can end with this is indeed the best time, and this is indeed the worst time, right? So as an emphasize, right? That's not how I ended, but you could, as an emphasize, do that. Do not repeat the whole paragraph though. A couple sentence maybe. Does that answer your question?
Okay. Yes.
All
I
right.
also have another question.
Yes, go ahead.
What if we don't know a proverb, for example, then we really want to write it? What do we do?
Well, if you mean you don't know the spelling, or you cannot find the exact word.
Cannot find an exact proverb.
You cannot find an exact proverb. There's really no ways of solving it on spot if you're already sitting in front of your exam paper and you really cannot think of it. Well, the only thing is just let it go. Think of something else. But when you get off the exam, alright, when the exam's over, Google it, look it up in a book, and try to remember that proverb so that you can use it in the future. So it's more about um, your daily intake of these words, memorizing them and knowing them.
Okay.
Yeah, during the exam, there's really nothing much you can do. You can't take your phone and Google it, right?
If we write a proverb but then it's wrong spelling, will our marks get deducted?
If you spelled it wrong, yes, mark will be deducted. Yes, it will be the language marks deducted. And if you used it incorrectly or if you misunderstood the proverb, it would also probably hurt your scores a little. So my suggestion is that only use a proverb if you're absolutely sure what it means. Right? So if you're
How do we?
uncertain,
Thank you. And how
no
do
worries.
we score band one for content?
How do you score band one for content? All right. So you first of all you have to have a complete story. You have to have a complete structure, and on top of that, think of creative ways. All right, to think of creative ways to develop your story. All right. Make your plot unique, but make sure you have a complete plot. That's the basis of everything. All right. Make it creative, and try to emphasize on a few important parts, right? For example, a graphic description of how James and Steve fought will give you a higher mark than simply saying James and Steve had a big fight, right? They're telling you the same thing, but with more details. Your teacher will know, okay, this student really thought about the fight. She really has a picture of what the fight is like. And the ideas are developed. That's how you get a higher band. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. All right.
Okay, bye.
Bye. All right. Any other questions? All right. If you do not have any questions, thank you for the 6 week of company. All right. Okay. Either teacher Celesta or teacher Chashna would meet you again next week. So let's look forward to that. All right. Okay. If you do not have any questions, this is end of the Tenapi live sharing. I hope you've enjoyed the sessions and have a good day. All right. Goodbye and thank you. Okay. Bye bye. Thank you. Bye bye, Rico. Bye bye, Primaya. Bye bye, Jingtian. All right. Bye bye, Daisy. Bye bye, Evangeline. All right. The recording will be available online sometime. I don't really know. I think tomorrow. It should be up by tomorrow. All right. Bye bye. All right. Bye bye, Evangeline. Bye bye, Han. Have a good day. Bye bye.